Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 38. It is January 28th, 2022. Okay, so January 28th, 2022, it is Friday morning. Well, Friday, it's not morning anymore, but I have a great guest for us today. This is Aaron Hunter with ConocoPhillips. So really pumped about this conversation we're going to have on the Permian Basin. But just to start out and sort of encapsulate what's going on in the global oil market. Quite a bit actually is going on in the global oil market. And, if Aaron's comfortable, we're definitely happy to touch on that. But this podcast will largely be focused on Conoco and the Permian. But oil prices WTI is hovering around 86, 82. So we're pushing this sort of $87 level. Brent is $90 a barrel right now. And natural gas, holy crap, the seesaw in the last couple of days. But right now it's saying it's 467. Check it back in 5 minutes. It could be 7. So it's all over the place given weather events. And there is no end in sight to the Russian-Ukrainian situation with Russian troops on the border, Russian troops also in Belarus, and lots of quietness out of China, which people should find a little bit alarming. So lots going on in the backdrop of the global oil market. But I love the Permian Basin, and as many do, and I love the rocks and I love the nerdiness. And I am honored to have a great guest today, Aaron Hunter with ConocoPhillips. Hello.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, glad to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to go through several topics, and you've listened to the podcast, so you kind of know it's rapid fire. And one, I should start this way. You're willing to interrupt me, so
Absolutely,
please
can
do. Awesome. And we're sort of settled on a couple main topics, and we might go on some tangents and stuff, which is okay. But the main, I want to sort of get into the Permian and nerdiness, given that you are the VP of operations for Midland, so you know this stuff. And I would like to get into sort of the Permian nerdiness with ConocoPhillips. Obviously, ConocoPhillips is a public company, and there's been a pretty big change from the 20 rigs that Conoco was running in January of 2020 versus the 10 rigs now. And that's reflective of sort of the public-private market bifurcation in all of the U.S., but specifically definitely in the Permian Basin. And then obviously Conoco has done 2 major acquisitions, one of which you're very familiar with Concho. So Concho and Shell coming up. And this is in light of sort of the backdrop of the big ESG push and the big adopting Paris Climate Accord agreements, the 2050 strategy. Right. So those are the 3 main things I think, and they're all very much interrelated. And I think it's a great, it's quite timely and a good topic and a really good company to just sort of think about and talk about in the Permian Basin.
Absolutely, looking forward to it. One small correction: I'm vice president over Midland Basin. I've got another counterpart over all the Delaware Basin. So.
Awesome. Yes, Vice President over Midland. Okay.
Yep.
So, and hopefully you'll be willing to touch a little bit on, more than just Midland, but that's perfectly okay if you can.
Yeah.
So the Permian in general for Conoco, I mean, something that the first thing that strikes my mind, and I know a lot of listeners are quite familiar with Permian. I mean, Enverus data is still showing, drilling info, Enverus is still showing under 5 million barrels per day, but we know that according to EIA, and we know, given all the well additions, we know the Permian's probably pushing what production levels it was before.
Right.
And Conoco did say, I mean, it wasn't broken out in the earnings call, or actually the production breakout was broken out in the earnings call. And Enverus shows you about 400,000 barrels per day for production for the Permian. But after the acquisitions, Conoco is going to be the single largest producer by far in the Permian Basin. So that's really significant. But I think it's interesting to think about just from the 20 rigs to 10 rigs and what's actually happening right now, what's going on the ground. And the Midland has thrived and done really well, especially over the course of 2020 and 2021. It kind of actually proved to the upside with lateral lengths and just delineation. So I'd just kind of like to get into the nerdiness, and we'll let you take from the top and go on, whatever things you really want to talk about on the Permian nerdy side.
Yeah, you bet. So some background on me. I moved to Midland about 17, 18 years ago. So I've been kind of a long-time Permian favorite or Permian fan down here. I started with Chevron, 7, 8 years there. Then I came over to Concho about 9 years ago. Of course, got acquired by Conoco now. And I can definitely say it's been better than expected. Nobody wants to be acquired by a bigger company, but I think it's been pretty good interaction so far. I think we're integrating well. There's some bumps here and there, but I think we're having a pretty good impact on the company. So for the Permian side, I mean, I know there was a major slowdown globally, but I would say it probably slowed down to about 75% speed in Midland. We never really hit rock bottom out here. Of course, when oil went negative, we were shutting in a bunch of stuff, but it really never slammed on the brakes. if anything, it probably helped us high grade rigs, high grade frac cores, and really kind of slow down and focus on what we were doing on the essentials. And then whenever we ramp back up, which we're doing right now, obviously as a basin, it just everything got more efficient. Some of those numbers you've already talked on is you can't really trust frac cores in the basin anymore. Just with stage per day efficiency, pump time efficiency, simul-frac efficiency, all those things kind of blur the line right now with the whole rig to frac core ratio. So I think the one fascinating thing out here for us is, I think we're at an all-time high or getting close to, not an all-time high, but approaching pre-COVID levels of rigs. But obviously the shift has mixed, or the mix has shift there. It's about 60% private now, 40% public or bigger companies. So the production growth you're seeing coming out of the Permian right now is not public driven, not major driven. It's all privates that are kind of coming together. And that's what they have to do. They have to chew through their acreage. They have to prove their value and work their inventory, while the big publics are we're generating free cash flow. We're not ramping up on emissions. We're doing everything that the market's indicating for us and not growing our production out the top. But despite all that, production in Permian is still climbing.
Yeah. So, I mean, you touch on a lot of great things there, and I think one is the Midland, and we can certainly encapsulate the Delaware, but the Midland really did prove it did prove extremely resilient, especially over the course of 2020 and 2021. And part of that I really think is because I had clients and stuff asking me a lot, and I would tell them, look, it's well known, it's shallower, it's a very well known play. That's where you had historically a ton of verticals. I mean, so I don't use the word easier because it's not, but it is a place that you can sort of like get down to business. You had a lot of privates that were able to move in sort of hot and heavy, and it was just lateral lengths now are what over 10,000 feet,
Yep.
pushing 11,000 feet on average. So you've really seen that step up in lateral length because of the getting all the acreage tied up together. And that's been, I think, proven really great for not just the publics, but also the privates in Midland. And so the Midland has really just been, I would say, exceptionally resilient, despite probably more resilient than in most oil plays all over the world in just a little pocket because of these number of different factors that sort of led to stability, being not easier to drill, but well-known, understandable, and able to increase those lateral lengths and get those efficiencies down.
I completely agree. I think that's how Midland Basin thrives. Is I kind of call Midland Basin economics. Of course, when you compare them to Delaware, they're basically sneaky good in Midland Basin. And I would say it's definitely not easy in Midland Basin, but it's certainly a lot less complex. Whether it's kind of more stacked layer cake geology, you don't have the complexity of the Delaware. You don't have the reservoir pressure of the Delaware, which hurts and helps. But yeah, for us personally as Conoco and some heritage Concho stuff in the Midland side, we've got, I think, 19 or 20 3-milers online now. We're just finishing fracking one of our 3.6 milers. So all that's pointing towards longer laterals, but really all that drives down towards is the way Midland wins is through efficiency. I mean, what the cost per foot, frac stages per day, whatever metric you want to look at it, the way we win in Midland is just
20
efficiency.
wells for a public company to have that many wells at 20, 3-mile long laterals. I think, when I think about if international folks are listening or people sort of maybe even not super familiar with the industry, 3-mile long, we've been doing 2 miles, basically since the beginning in North Dakota, in the Williston Basin, but we weren't really doing that necessarily everywhere else. And partly because that was because of acreage, but it's also, there was a comfortableness level, I think, with a lot of folks of, how well can you actually complete the toe of that? Well, how well can you actually complete the very end? The drill outs, all the things. A lot of that I think has incrementally gotten better. And obviously I do think high oil prices help because it's sort of, if you miss a little bit here and there, it's sort of not the end of the world. It's like, well, when we were arguing about well spacing in, the Turner Formation in the Powder River Basin, it didn't work at $50 oil, but I think you can tighten up a lot of things right now and everything sort of looks good at 90. So I think part of that definitely willing to be pushing the envelope is you got high oil prices, and why instead of drilling 2 wells, and doing a whole top on everything in surface location, you might as well do another one. And I think just we're not seeing, I look at the decline curves, and I've looked at ConocoPhillips as well, and it's not like you're improving year over year, but you're not degrading. They're roughly in line. You're looking at 5-year normalized decline curves for all of the Permian Basin for ConocoPhillips, and they stack in each other nicely, stack on top of each other really nicely. So it's not like you're seeing diminishing marginal returns, which means you're right. Those efficiencies that if you're doing a 3-mile long lateral, I'm guessing that you're going to try to have more than one or, handful of wells. So you want to simul-frac, and you want to create as many efficiencies as possible in those operations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it. If we have a 4 well pad and they're all 3 miles, I can drill 12 miles of lateral from one pad, and that just makes things a lot easier.
Okay, so in the earnings call, they did mention that you have 15 operator rigs total for Conoco, and we know from Inverse, your data as least earlier this month there were 10 rigs running. They've been about 10 rigs right in the Permian for Conoco,
Yes.
and for a while. That's off the 20 rigs running in January 2020. It came down significantly, and then it sort of edged back up. I don't know where you bottomed at, but it's edged back up from. You've added a few rigs back. You're sort of hanging at that 10. And then I think the earnings call also said 17 total frac crews. And so I don't know how many frac crews you have running in the Permian, but obviously the majority of the activity, given that 10 of those 15 rigs are in the Permian, the majority of the activity is in the Permian. And I guess I would like to illuminate the listeners, because when I think about activity in the Permian and when I break it out for clients and I'm studying, I love to show rigs. I love to show permits. I love to show ducks, even though we know ducks are not a great indicator
Yeah.
for a lot of
Yeah.
things. But together they can tell you stories. And then I like to show actual well completions. So what are the well additions, and that's not perfect either, but it's how many wells we're bringing online, and in addition to the big public private split that we see on the rig side. And just to point out, I mean, as of the beginning of January, we had nearly 282 rigs running in the Permian. 22 public companies were running 146 rigs, where you had over 50 private operators running 136 rigs. And the reason I want to bring that to the well completion side is that, we basically, to be adding oil production, when you're breaking out the well completions in the Permian, you start seeing the same thing where you see the publics are bringing on, they are starting to bring back wells. And in the Permian Basin as a whole, when you're looking at well completions, it's not recovered completely. We're not pre-covered, pre-COVID levels where we're adding, 400 wells a month, but we're
Right.
nearing there. And
Yeah.
it's recovered much better than any other basin. But the privates have really ratcheted up significantly, and the publics are coming along, but it's not quite there. So I'm just curious if you can give us a little color on, and if you can't speak to that exactly for Conoco on the exact number of wells, that's fine. But I'd like to know the trajectory and sort of how is the with the 10 rigs and the wells you're bringing online. Is it steady? Is it steady as you go, and it's just going to be sort of incremental? What does it sort of look like on that side?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Activity-wise is steady, but obviously as you get more efficient at your steady rig, you're going to do more wells. And honestly, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but we're going to have a similar number of wells as last year, I think. With holding flat at the 10 rigs. I think the 10 rigs is pre-show. I think we're more than that post-show. That closed in December. So and on the frac side, I think what I love about the frac side, I think we have 4 or 5 frac cores right now out here. What I love about those is, granted, I don't research everybody's frac cores every day, but on the Conoco side, and we kind of started on the Concho side, all of we don't have any more diesel frac rigs anymore. They're either all Tier 4 or E-frac right now on our frac rigs. So, which is honestly the Tier 4 dual fuel, man, that's turning out to be a pretty nice setup, just efficiency wise, and of course you save on all the diesel. So we really like the uptime on all those rigs. So basically flat activity, but like I said, the more I think if you shave your efficiency off like 10%, that's another 3 wells a year. So pretty good.
And on that, can we talk a little bit about the Tier 4 and the electric? Because
Yeah.
I was listening to the Halliburton's call, and I don't know if Liberty's had theirs yet, but I mean everybody's obviously talking about the electric, and I do think it's fascinating, because Halliburton only a couple of years ago was saying we're not doing that, and now obviously they're doing it, and everyone's leaning into it because there is so much demand, from public companies to lower, to be able to say they're lowering their carbon footprint, and they want to say this through the electric frac fleet side. And then there's sort of an illumination to are the frac companies actually making money with this is a question, but from the standpoint right now of what actually makes sense for both from the service provider and the operator is that the operator gets to use it, right? And I think EOG was one of the big push, at least in the Permian, of saying using a bunch of electric frac fleets, but the dual being able Tier 4 dual fuel versus electric and what fuel you're using. I mean, right now with gas prices as high as they are, with diesel prices as high as they are,
Right.
and versus or tying into the grid. I mean, the pricing, all that matters, right?
Absolutely matters. Yeah, 100%. The one thing I would note is, like I said, small brag here, and I think it's public, but on the Concho side, Concho was one of the first ones to have the Tier 4 out here in the basin. I think EOG beat us, or somebody else beat us on the E-frac, but
But no, you guys were big on it.
yeah, Concho had the first Tier 4 out here, which kind of felt nice. But for that, obviously when gas is low and diesel was high, it was amazing savings on the tier 4. With tier 4, you get up to, I think, 60-70% replacement of diesel, which is pretty good, especially when you're running steady state. I think steady state, they can do like 80% replacement, but then you ramp up, ramp down for stages. Averages out between 50 and 60% displacement. But we're big fans of the dual fuel, and I would say we're working our way through the e-frac side.
Yeah, and that's probably, I mean, I know people talk about it, and you don't have to get, because you're public, but I know people talk about it a lot. I don't think the data is quite out. No one says, no one's explicitly saying this is what it costs us, and on either side. So we're not hearing, we're not hearing a whole lot of clarity from the service companies of here's what we paid for, here's what we're charging,
Right.
and we're not hearing the same thing from the public companies. Although everybody wants to talk about it because it sounds really good with this ESG stuff, and I would put a little bit of caution to people of it does eventually have to make money for this to actually for this to work.
Well, I think it's just going to be just like every other breakthrough technology is, it's going to be expensive at first. And as you learn things and grind out the efficiencies, it's going to compete.
Right. Absolutely. And I think there'll be a lot of progression, and it's quite new.
Yep,
so there's one tangent I want to pick up, and that's because I did listen to you guys are going to have your earnings call in a few days. But I was listening to the last couple, and the inflation piece, which I thought has been, it was sort of downplayed by many operators in the last couple quarters, the inflation piece. I think I'm guessing it's not going to be able to be as downplayed as much. I feel like inflation, and maybe not so much Midland, but I just feel like inflation in the Permian has to be, people absolutely have to be feeling this. So I want to get into the nerdiness of sort of well spacing and stuff like this, and investor pressure. But what's the inflation side of looking of these? I'm hearing OCTG, obviously, pipe is expensive, chemicals, getting them, and, not just inflation, but the ability to get stuff, especially if it's not made in the U.S., feels like it could be very problematic or potentially problematic.
Yep. Yeah. But, and honestly, I think that's probably one of the nice things that Conoco's brought to the table on this whole thing in the Permian is we've got this long-term supply contracts for pipe and everything, tubulars. And I can't comment on actual numbers of inflation, but it is real in the Permian. It is real everywhere, I think, obviously. I think we are probably seeing it on the steel side more than any other side. Chemicals are doing okay. But on the drilling side, what's amazing is a lot of these drilling efficiencies we keep seeing are cutting through a lot of the inflation. So the completion side is it is what it is. Whenever you're pumping 22 hours a day, it's kind of hard to get, the 23rd and 24th hour a day of pump time. But the efficiencies we're seeing on the drilling mostly are cutting through a ton of the inflation side. And just hats off to all the drillers out there that are making it work.
Yeah, and I think people really, and I harp on it a lot, because a lot of people sort of look at the rig count and they look at the drilling stuff and they say, yeah, it's meaningless. And I think you really have to break out, and I love showing people and showing clients of and when I give presentations, is just the average lateral length, right? Break out the average lateral length, even sometimes by operator, and you see, holy moly, these 3 mile long laterals, and the ability, people in the Permian, and they said the same thing in the Powder, a few years ago, pre-COVID, it was the ability to go, one, the Delaware has, it's deep. So not every company was comfortable, actually, drilling at vertical depth of 12 to 13,000 feet, pressures, temperatures, sort of, you name it. But then it was sort of like after that, then it was how far are you going to go in the lateral length? And it was the speed. And it seemed to be like everybody was hung up of, no, it takes well over 2 weeks in the Delaware. And I always tell people, just look at a previous downturn. Every time we have a drop, people get smarter, people get faster. And lo and behold, it took a matter, I would say even almost, it wasn't a quarter. It was a month, maybe even weeks that the speed at which drilling got better. And part of that, I think, was getting the right people into the right companies, having the right drilling guy to go to push it. But it was almost overnight that people in the Permian, and I would say the Powder as well, where it was, no, we can't do this under, 15 days. And all of a sudden it gets crushed. And maybe 15 days is pushing it. But I mean, we were hearing a lot of folks who, it was 20 days per well, some folks it was a month, and in other basins, I mean, here in the DJ, and it's much easier to drill in the DJ Basin, but you can spud the TD in a few days now. And we're pushing these lateral lengths of 3 miles as well. So when I was hearing this I think it's really important for people to think about that. Yeah, can you offset your costs? And people would say maybe that's BS. I don't think it's BS. I think you can truly, if you're dramatically increase the speed at which you're drilling and you're drilling those longer laterals, that takes it gives you a lot more flexibility in the time perspective as well.
I absolutely agree 100% with that. And just from the Midland side, it was to go from 2 to 3 to 3.5 miles. And I know we're not the only ones doing. Other companies have longer laterals, but some of our some of our proudest moments out here is we had 8, 10, 12, not 8, like we went from 14 days per 2 mile lateral down to 10. I think we just did one sub 10. But then you
Oh,
look
wow.
around and there's other people doing it in 7 and 8 days that are a little bit more eastern in the Midland Basin, a little more shallow out there. But there's people doing it routinely sub 10 now.
Yeah. And then, and you're probably not seeing that quite on the frac side. But I would think that even if the costs, right, you have inflation on the frac side, and again,
Right.
you don't need to talk to the amount, but we know we have it. Everybody knows we have inflation in the economy. We know can't find truck drivers and everything. So you're gonna have inflation on sand, fluid, chemicals, you name
Right.
it. So you're gonna have inflation on completions. But if you're doing it faster, or just consistently, and you don't have that downtime, that's what the frac companies want too, right? They don't want that downtime because they're not getting paid.
Right.
So everybody's sort of in it to win it. And then if you have these longer laterals, so if you got two wells lined up next to each other and they're pushing 3 miles and you're fracking all that, you have efficiencies because
Yep.
you're not moving. You're doing 3 miles, 3 mile wells instead of 2 miles, and you're doing 2 wells at once. So you're going to bake in those efficiencies, and those are going to continue to grow. So I would say, even probably to some degree, I'm guessing that this year will be a big deal for pushing the envelope for the efficiencies on the simul-frac side.
Absolutely. One of the things we're realizing in Midland Basin, or actually across the whole Permian, is this in-basin sand. I know you've heard about it before, but the fact that we can just locate the
I'm
sand
obsessed
mine
with
10,
sand.
15 miles
Yeah.
of, it's amazing. But okay, so it's one thing to have sand in basin and only 10 or 15 miles from your frac location, but logistics to get it there, pull it out of the ground, wash it, dry it, everything else. The logistics behind that is just, it's almost thinking of like Uber for sand delivery now, of how they're handling loads between jobs, and it's just amazing how all that stuff works. And it's been tight a few times on sand, but we have yet to be waiting on it.
Yeah, and I think I will say that I'm not confident that across the whole basin everyone will be
Yeah.
using localized sand, but I do think that if you're pushing big companies who are trying to run these big operations and they need the sand, and you've got inflation, that local, I'm talking like near the pad, near the site,
Right.
those are going to develop in earnest over the course of 2022. And I've mentioned it before, Nomad Proppant. I think companies like them are going to. There's a few others that are going to be popping up because if you have it in the technology, and I think these are small solutions on the frac side, whether you're pumping wet sand or you're pumping not. If you are pumping wet sand, you do get a ESG benefit and a carbon benefit because you're not drying this stuff. So there are lots of little things in here that, again, they take some time to work out. I don't think every slug of private operators are doing it, but I would guess that some publics would sort of be leaning into this a little bit. And it probably, if the inflation piece and the bite creeps up, this might be an incentive as well to get it as local as possible, to remove that sort of the Uberizing.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's just kind of call it the Texas spirit, or the West Texas oil field spirit. Is kind of an old adage. If you give an engineer and a landman an idea, they'll go figure it out. And it's kind of what they're doing.
Yep. So I'm going to push you a little bit now on okay. So Midland, which I love. I love the Midland, and I would like to know sort of thinking about the well spacing and stuff. And if you can talk to the Delaware a bit, I think that'd be great. And the reason I bring it up is because I often talk to folks that listen to the podcast, and I talk to clients and give folks I give presentations to all the time, is the evolution of investor pressure. And I always kind of bring it back to like, well, a few years ago, we were talking about well spacing and how, some New York analysts were talking about, oh, the well spacing didn't work. And you kept seeing in the Wall Street Journal and everything. And it was over and the business was over and the Permian was going to be dead. And everybody lied about their well spacing and it's just terrible. And that was not the case, obviously. So we bucked through that trend and we've moved on. And that's why I really think people have to be very, very careful about thinking about what investors push on and how that ebbs and flows and how transient and transitory that is in nature. But it really is actually well spacing is still a very big deal in terms of well spacing, well orientation, like how when you complete the wells, the order in which you're completing the wells, all these things actually really matter. And now in earnings calls, we don't even hear about the nerdy stuff that I love. Nobody even talks about well performance or anything. It's here's production and here's this, and then let's talk about ESG and emissions. And I really do think, these are still oil companies. They still produce oil, and yes, oil prices are high. But I think this nerdy element I'd like to talk about of sort of and it still matters for a lot of analysts, a lot of folks of just understanding the oil market is, what does it look like? I mean, we know that decline curves are sort of on top of each other, but it doesn't seem like they're diminishing or declining. So we sort of bucked that trend on the well spacing, and is there any nerdy cool stuff, or what does that sort of look like? And am I right on the orientation and the timing in which you're completing? And I imagine we're still learning on a lot of that.
Yeah, I would say we're probably in the fifth or sixth inning on spacing is kind of how I would put it. We've all learned a ton. Of course, Concho had its own learnings on spacing as well as others. We all kind of did it at the same time. You're right, it was pushed by our own drive, investor drive to drum up resource, drum up well count, drum up sticks. I think we all fell into that trap, and of course, we didn't know at the time. You don't know until you. I guess hindsight's 2020 on those. So we were all doing that at the same time. Some companies were more public with it than others, but I think through the downturn, through the oil price dip, and just the sheer learning that we all did on the reservoir side of this, as I guess to get really technical, when you space wells close together and you frack them and bring them online for the first 90, 120, 180 days, those wells don't know they're tight. They don't know they're close together. They haven't seen that boundary dominated flow yet. So whenever people see the news 3 months in, 4 months in, 5 months in, and these wells look just like they used to, that's, we cheer and let's go do more. But then the people that get ahead of themselves and they go drill a bunch more at that spacing, and it takes them another 6 months to get them online. Now the wells that are 10 months old are declining a lot faster than they thought they would. And then you're kind of in a trap because you've already drilled more wells at the tight spacing. So I think for the most part, most operators have already dug themselves out on that. And I think again, we have different spacing than other peers and competitors in the basin. But I think for the most part, people have found their type curve model with the right economic model, and they're sticking with it. But I was just having a conversation today again around spacing, and we're trying to determine how much spacing is a factor of oil price, and we don't know the answer yet. But kind of an interesting theory to run down.
Yeah, and I mean that's why I kind of push it is that obviously with the surge of these private operators, drilling, completing wells, which think that even just a few years ago, many people said that you would not see that day was over for the U.S. And right. I make it very clear to people, private operators are dominating the rig count, the completions activity, everything in the U.S. And that is going to have implications for how it all sort of plays out. So I would guess that some of these private operators haven't yet figured out their exact well spacing and the timing. I mean, when you say the 10 months later, it doesn't know, but particularly like in the Delaware, and I think parts of the Midland as well. But when you have these overpressured, it's the timing of when you're doing sequencing and you're doing the, multiple layers, right? We're wine racking or it's beyond wine racking at that point because you have multiple layers. But that piece, what my question is that if you have the publics that have brought their rig counts way down, is that being managed efficiently or accurately of like, okay, I mean, we saw how many rigs Exxon had pre-COVID, and they were mowing down a whole section in New Mexico. That was over 50 rigs, right? And they were really mowing it down. And basically there was some good logic to that because it was like, we're doing this all at once. We're doing all these reservoirs at once. And the sort of logic behind that before was that you want to drain it all at once. You don't want to come back a year later or 2 years later. So are we sort of foregoing some of that, or are we going to be able to go back and sort of do some of that?
The answer is both. It depends on the basin. I think what I learned, or what we learned in Midland Basin a long time ago, was no matter what you do, call it the Zone A. No matter what you do in Zone A, is probably going to influence Zone B and Zone C around you.
Absolutely.
But it's all accretive economics. So if you're in Zone A and the zone above you is only a 15% or 10% rate of return or whatever, some marginal economics, you don't really care about that damage. But if the zone below you is really accretive and call it a 50% rate of return or whatever, some high number, then you probably want to think about co-developing those zones together or come back to a surprise whenever you want to do it. I think for the most part, that learning, again, I'm speaking mainly for the Midland Basin here. I think for the Midland Basin, it's pretty well defined the damage you're going to do above and below and side by side with a single well. We can quantify that. I think with the complexity of the Delaware, the geology changes so fast, and there's a lot more carbonate stringers over there that, the carbonate stringers will act as a frac barrier. So I think there's a lot more figuring out to do over there on the spacing. Plus, they have, frankly, more actual rock space between their landing zones, so potentially less damage there. But it is real. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I just think it's nice because I think a lot of people think it's figured out, and I think you're right. Probably for the Midland, It's well defined, and still, I'm sure there's incremental learnings and stuff you guys can do and folks do. But I think that most like there's no way the Delaware everyone is completely figured
Sure,
out what's the perfect
sure.
secret sauce. And I do think that this shift by Publix, and I'm not saying you guys, but the shift by Publix of other big companies, that you can't go from 55 rigs to 10 rigs and, and everything be the same. Like your
Right.
development process and everything just isn't the same. And that is something investors and shareholders and folks have to take into account. But I think, the interesting thing with you guys is, and I put this out for the number, the actual number, because you're right in that. Well, I think your last two earnings calls talk about the basically the production's going to stay roughly flattish, right? There's no going to be massive increase. But just for the numbers, I was looking this up. It's so, and I think about this in terms of the wells. So when people talk about 11.5 million barrels a day crude oil production in the U.S., I say we did it relatively easy in some ways because we don't have nearly as many wells that we were bringing online as we were in the past years when we were 13 million barrels per day. And to put this into perspective, I mean, for Conoco, the Enverus numbers, the drilling info numbers, are 2019 was 363 wells for the Permian. 2020 was 229 wells, and the wells that are in the books for 2021 are 176. And I was looking at the first 3-month oil production, first 6-month oil production. And the last 2020, 2021 were really in line. They were the first 3-month were about the same. First 6-month, though, there was an increase. So even in 2021, there was an increase in the first 6-month oil production. It moved up considerably, which was kind of exciting. And the cum liquids has actually edged up as well. Is that there's more liquids. It went from 68 to 79 in 3 years. And then the lateral length, I mean, just people, again, I know I harp on this lateral thing, but I think it's awesome is that in 2018, the average lateral length for Conoco was 8,700 feet, and now it's 10,500 feet, roughly,
Right.
average lateral
Right.
length. That's huge. I mean, and if you're showing that first 6-month production performance is actually increasing, that's pretty meaningful.
Yep, agreed. I would say that's definitely lateral length accretive, but I think that points to some of the industry wide upspacing we've been doing as well, as far as seeing that increase in the 6 and 9 month numbers.
Right.
I
And
think
is
that
that, when you
shows
say
things
the
declining slower.
is that industry wide upspacing? I mean, is that are we talking 100 feet, 200 feet? Or are we sort of, and like you said, when we were talking Midland, we've sort of figured it out. Is that, are people sort of split the difference of like, hey, we get a little benefit here, but we don't want to like lose all we don't want to lose all our holes in the ground. So have we sort of got to a level where people are okay with, but it's not destroying your
Yeah.
acreage value as well?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, every operator is going to be different based on their own financial metrics they want, so the financial return metrics. I would say for the most part, the operators in Midland and for the most part, somewhat Delaware, that whatever you've chosen your spacing to be, you're comfortable with it. I don't think there's too many spacing tests going up and down. Whether it's four wells per section for one company, 10 wells per section for another company, I think they've convinced themselves through their own degradation curves that what they're doing is right.
Yeah, especially I think for the publics, you're probably right with that. So, yeah, I mean, is there anything else you would like to any little nerdy factoids that I'm sort of glossing over here on? I mean, there's a million things that we could get into on sand and spacing and all kinds of things.
One
But
thing you touched on earlier that I think is really, really muddies the water is this whole duck count conversation. Of course, no duck is created
oh yeah,
equal. Like on the private side, and I know I'm generalizing broadly here, but on the private side, the quick pace, I think they have generally smaller projects, 3-4 well projects here and there. But then with the public side, which you touched on Exxon, and I know Midland Basin, I try to do it Midland Basin as well, is we have these bigger projects. And it just to illustrate the skew of some of the numbers, if you're running, call it 4 rigs in an area, but every one of those rigs is drilling a 15 well project, you're just by default going to have more ducks. That and they're not. I mean, I struggle with the definition of a duck because it's drilled uncompleted.
uh,
Yes, you can't complete it until the rig moves off the entire project. So I would caution anybody really to look at ducks and say there's a great untapped resource here in ducks, and I think it's just largely those are wells waiting to be fracked until the project's developed.
100%, and a really, really good tangent because I think I literally I literally put slides together and I only show ducks And when people ask about it, it's only to say, this is not a duck the way you used to think about it. This is not, a bunch of wells that are just sitting here. The duck is basically just a function of, it was drilled and it's going to be completed at some point, probably near soon. So the thing to think about it though is that, I mean, you're right. If how many rigs you have versus how much you're drilling, you're just going to have this function of ducks that's going to continue to sort of roll over. And it's not the same as we're leaving 20 ducks to frack next year or whatever. It's not that same anymore. However, it is important because if you're looking at it in the same where, and I think it's really, because I'm actually looking right now at a map that shows private and public, like the private and public companies, and it's ducks, and it's for Midland only. And you can see that it's very different, right? The publics are the privates are kind of all over. Same for the rigs. You can look at every basin across the country, look at rigs, look at permits, look at ducks, and the privates are all over the place, right? They are in essence a little more nimble, flexible, and the publics are well concentrated, right? Even the ducks are relatively well concentrated.
That's right.
All this actually has pretty profound implications for the service sector. Anybody which is broad and wide. It is not just frac companies, it is tools, it is everything that is involved in the service sector, because they're pivoting now to work with private operators, and private operators aren't going to necessarily have perfectly predictable well performance. And I mean, they're not necessarily going to have everything delineated. They're not necessarily going to have well spacing perfectly figured out. They are going to be, testing and doing things, which can be great for some service providers working in that space. But it's just not the sort of like we had the analysis of U.S. oil production figured out. I think that's shifting. It's not gonna. We're gonna have to sort of change that. Think of, yes, we kind of, with the publics we know, because sadly all the publics have slowed down and focused on other things. But these privates are going to be doing other things, and it is going to impact the publics as well. I mean, what the privates do and the function of getting things and what the basin looks like and everything is going to impact publics. And I still think, and I do kind of want to shift gears into acquisitions and some of your earnings calls, but I think I actually think that the market isn't settled in terms of, I mean, I know the publics think it is, but just because today holding flat at $90 oil, which I still think is shocking. I mean, it's $90 Brent, and yet the idea that you don't want to increase output even a little bit is mind-blowing to me, because the money that would be returned to investors is huge. And actually, I mean, so you're making a lot of money on this oil, and the ability to actually grow actually the dividend and everything based upon putting a little bit more to CapEx might be quite smart. That conversation, at least yet, has not happened. And I think it should start to happen. There's no way in the boardroom that isn't something that's popping into people's minds, at least for private operators. I know it is.
Right. Yeah.
So agreed. I guess with that, if we want to kill the duck conversation, which was a great point, by the way, really great point, and move into this sort of the acquisition. So, and you're former Concho, right?
Yes.
Yes. So the Concho space well, and company I love to follow. I mean, great earnings calls. You learned a ton. And again, this is to my point of the earnings things we used to talk about, well spacing and well additions and all this stuff. And that's sort of, we don't get that color on these publics. And I think that is meaningful for people analyzing these basins and performance. But so two big acquisitions. I mean, Conoco, which I think is really smart and very smart actually for buying Concho. And I think Shell will look back and realize this was a pretty stupid decision to sell it, but also really smart by Conoco to buy it. I mean, this is one of your best. I mean, this is some of the best rock in the entire world is in the Permian Basin. And Shell is this perfect little, if you pull up the acreage or just pull up the ConocoPhillips thing, you'll see it's like, it's not in New Mexico. And I love New Mexico rock. It's fantastic, but it's right off the border. So you have no federal lands issues. And it's just like smack there. And people kept asking in the earnings calls from Conoco, they kept asking about the efficiencies and the synergies and they weren't even echoing. And I thought, look at the map. It's like, this is just kind of this wouldn't be a bad deal for most people, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
I completely agree. And I'll brag on our BD department for a while on that one. I was not on the inside of that one because it was more Delaware than Midland, but yeah, hats off to them. And of course, cash does wonders on certain things, obviously, but the way that was accretive in Texas, both from a non-op and operated position, and just now the fodder we have to go through to optimize trades, to develop, to really control the pace of development out there. It was a very, very, the Shell one, of course, that was a very accretive transaction for Conoco in the basin.
Yeah.
I think many people, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just said, I think many people will look back on that and kind of try to keep recalculating how good of a deal that was, how good of a transaction that was, I guess.
I think so too. I mean, I'm serious that I think history is going to judge Shell unfavorably on this one, and history is going to judge a lot of publics unfavorably. So that's what's fast. I mean, I want to focus on these acquisitions for a second, but I do want to put them in context of. I think it's a little fascinating that, and I hope analysts are will be strong enough to push questions a little bit harder on public companies to say, look, you're telling me that you have this triple mandate, which is what for Conoco is it's meet the energy transition pathway demand, achieve net zero emissions and net zero emission ambition, and deliver competitive returns. Well, so that's the this three-pronged strategy. Two of those are in sort of the ESG, and ConocoPhillips, which I was shocked, especially given these acquisitions and who ConocoPhillips is. I was shocked that they sort of got jumped into the Paris Climate Accord agreement and said we're going net zero by 2050. So to me, that is a bit of pandering, but regardless, it's the first company to do this, and there's these two things. I think that's fascinating in light of the fact that you're an oil company. You just had two major acquisitions in the Permian Basin, which says we're producing oil. We bought these not because we want to sit on our thumbs. No, we're not going to go crazy and produce the oil and lose all returns, but we did buy them. I mean, we are an oil company. I mean, that's not stated clearly that, hey, there's a reason, but that's a big deal. And I think that's what is actually more broadly, when people step back and look at what companies say and what they do, oil companies are making money on drilling, completing wells, and making really good money right now, and doing it in a, reducing your methane, reducing your CO2. All those are great in the grand scheme of things. Particularly, I think the methane thing is probably even more important than the CO2. But I mean, those acquisitions are in light of and in spite of and at the same time of all this big ESG push as well.
Absolutely, and I probably don't know enough about the Paris Accord and everything, so I probably can't speak too much on that one. However, I do actually like this we call it triple mandate, because I mean, they're not really mutually exclusive. We are going to deliver energy for the transition. I think we all know it. Oil, for the large parts, something you've said on previous podcasts is you don't like fossil fuel, the name fossil fuels. I absolutely agree with you. I think more about it as energy density. So the energy density of oil is so much better than energy density of wind, solar, whatever, and only less. Natural gas is only slightly less energy dense than oil. So I think meeting this transition pathway for demand, it's going to depend on oil. It's going to depend on gas. I don't think there's any way to deny that. But in the next 150 years, who knows what kind of energy source you're going to be using down the road. So to get from here to there, that's this meet transition pathway demand. That's part of that. But then to deliver accretive returns, you touched on it, is Shell was very accretive returns. I think Concho was very accretive returns for Conoco as well. And this is where I get maybe a little bit of hometown pride. I think we are going to develop it a lot more efficiently, more prudently than previous owners. Maybe not Concho. I'll show some Concho pride there, but certainly on the Shell side, we'll deliver it a lot more efficiently and prudently than they may have. And I think that's just the responsible thing to do. And then the third part of the mandate, I get it. I don't know if it's pandering or not, but I mean, it's kind of where everything's headed right now. And I guess we'll figure it out as we go.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's fair. And I'm not going to challenge you that you're a publicly traded company and you're on a public podcast. So I get that. I think it just that I do think that it's going to take some real leadership in the space. I absolutely agree that ConocoPhillips is, I would 100%, I'm a betting person. And if this was like football, I'd pick ConocoPhillips over Shell to execute on actually turning the Permian into something because they had struggled over time. And the fact, just the idea that they would even sell it, even conceptually. And if you listen to their earnings calls and how they talk, they're now full Q&A. I mean, they're not even, because of the shareholder pressure and everything, because of the Dutch court ruling. And I think the U.S. companies just have to be very cognizant of that they're not even able to sort of run their company as an oil and gas company. And the way they're explaining it to folks is that they are, they're transitioning, right? They need the oil money to transition to the other stuff. And I think it's going to be prudent for U.S. oil companies to be more honest about that, saying this is the way you say that. And I think it's a good way to clarify meeting the transition pathway demand is that, you're producing oil and gas for this time period. And I think it was your CEO that said on the last call that the energy transition is happening. And I would call, yes, it is happening. I think the degrees to that are gonna shift over time. And I also think that, and I just think the operators and leaders in these companies, especially in public earnings calls, are gonna have to be honest with that too. And it's going to be important because your shareholders may want you to be producing a little more oil at $90 a barrel, or things can shift and things will shift politically.
Sure.
I mean, it's going to happen, and that can change the impact on Paris Accord. Lots of different things. So that's sort of separate. So I like your hometown pride, especially on the Concho. Agree with the actually developing it from a company perspective. But the acquisitions and the integration. I mean, that's you guys. I know the integrate. Obviously, the Shell integration hasn't happened yet, right? That closed, but that's not like those aren't in house, and that will right.
They are.
They are in house. Okay.
They are. They are.
But the production, so is that included? So in the 790,000 barrels a day, I think it's it was like 400 some for the Permian, 400 some thousand barrels a day for the Permian, 217,000 barrels a day for the Eagle Ford, and 95,000 barrels a day for the Bakken. That's not inclusive of
that
Shell.
would be ex Shell, right?
Okay, yeah, so that's going to increase considerably, and then I assume the next earnings call and the next couple quarters we're going to hear lots more about this whole. Okay,
that's my job.
Oh yeah, that'll be exciting. And super fun. Yeah, so then that's great. And Shell, is there anything on the Midland side? Are you guys getting anything, or that's all Delaware?
I think there might have been very, very few like non-operated properties, but nothing operated. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, not enough. I think were some questions. So, okay, anything else you want to add on the acquisition side that I'm leaving out? Oh, it's a good topic.
No, other than just I think it has been from the Concho to Conoco side. Yeah, so I said that right. Concho to Conoco. I definitely think it's been better than expected. I think the tide is turning out here for the heritage Concho folks, and it's been a good ride. And I think there's some optimism coming out here, and we're all looking forward to the Shell piece.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that kind of gets me. I think that also in the earnings call, that was really so. I say that the energy transition was emphasized. I think by the CEO saying that the triple mandate, the energy transition, but also emphasized was that a very effective integration of Concho, having a huge shale portfolio, and efficiencies, obviously with longer laterals and everything, and I guess I've thought about this a little more, given I was going to have you on the podcast, and I was thinking about this, and had I just been talking about Conoco without you on here, I might have said some more critical things, and it made me think a little differently, because I was thinking, well, actually the ability to acquiring those assets and emphasizing this huge shale portfolio does tell the street I have massive flexibility, right? It does tell the street that I am flexible. I am able to, increase and ramp up. I guess I want to ask a little bit on this, is that a couple of years ago, ConocoPhillips had a big presentation, and I don't know if you weren't with them then, but
Probably
it was
not.
a big presentation on the change. It was the big Investor Day presentation,
Okay.
and it was on how they were changing the adding rigs and dropping rigs was not efficient, right? Every downturn, everybody adds rigs and drops rigs, and you actually lose a ton of money getting people spooling up, spooling down. It's a mess.
Yep.
And they were saying
very,
we need
very
to
inefficient.
Yes, inefficient. They need to sort of stay the course. And I thought, is that, is the 10 rig thing drives me a little crazy and it obviously probably won't stay at 10 rigs with the Shell acquisition.
Shell piece,
that's probably going to increase somewhat, and sort of has to, right? Because then, you can't go unless you're going to stay at 10 forever. But I would assume then you don't want to really drop from there. But I would imagine that creeping up a little bit, it's going, $90 barrel oil, like creeping up a little bit, and just the nature of the business. And sometimes you're going to have to add rigs here and there, because it's the opportune time and moment. And that acreage might need to be drilled to be held for numbers of different reasons.
Sure.
So do you think that still makes sense that Conoco is not going to spool up, spool down, that now we're sort of at this steady level and that you can sort of hold it, but also increase a little bit when you want to?
I do think so. Of course, I don't know what the numbers are yet, but we kind of characterize it as probably a heritage Concho term. We kind of think of it like a steady ship. It's, when you're trying to pick up rigs or lay down rigs real quick, things just get really messy, really inefficient. You lose things through the crack. But when you run it steady, call it at 10 rigs, then you can really get a lot of data analytics in, just a ton of efficiency, drive a lot of efficiencies towards that, because you're spending your time on that, not trying to plan for the next rig move and trying to pick up rigs, lay down rigs, and all the stuff that brings. So I do like. I mean, of course, we can all argue that to increase a little bit on the just increase rigs a little bit, basically decrease some of your free cash flow, and increase. We'll probably make more money for that, but then you're back into the same scenario we were in 2018. I guess 2019 is as soon as enough people do that and something happens globally and your oil prices crash, then you wish you would have just stayed flat. So I don't know. I'm not sure if we're trying to skate to where the puck is or it's going to be, or if we're just holding steady for efficiencies. But I mean, I get it and I like it.
Yeah, well, and you segue into a perfect thing I want to talk about, and you did that very nicely. So thank you. Is that this free cash flow? This back to this sort of investors and shareholders and everything, and just the chain. I mean, I don't know if every single person in the world listens to, and they obviously don't, but the people in the oil space probably have listened to earnings calls over the course of, beyond the last 2 years. So you'd know that there's a pretty divergence. I mean,
Right.
Publics, small publics, big majors, the tone is everything shifted. 3 years, the earnings calls are very, very different. And shale companies being profitable is one of them. This free cash flow thing is huge. I mean, we had an industry where everyone said this business will never make money, and lo and behold, making money hand over fist. And if you're not making money at these prices, you do not need to be in this business. Like,
Right.
you're probably not going to make, because if you can't make money now, you're just not going to be able to. But I think it was the last quarter was $3 billion. You guys had $3 billion in free cash flow, $6 billion, I think, in 2021. So it was a total with share buybacks. So it's a massive amount of money, including with share buybacks being returned to shareholders. And there is a big push, especially by the majors on this, and the big boys on the share buybacks. Is share buyback, dividends, variable dividends, sort of, you name it and you hear it. And we're talking billions. I mean, this is that, and you just think about it, billions of that. Yeah, those are okay. I don't know. Let's call it 10 million. We're probably edging back to 10 million on drilling a well. I'm sure it dropped considerably, but I'm giving, with inflation and stuff, 10 million drill well. $1 billion is a lot of wells. I mean, 100 million. I mean, it's just, and at $90 oil and 1,000 barrels a day. I mean, this adds up. So there is some math to be said about, the big shareholder push by investors of like, well, we're giving it all back to you. Well, you're not going to be, it's a dance though. And it works at high oil prices. It's like, well, I can keep everything flat. Oil prices are high, so I can give you back all this money. Oil prices could go down. I may need to start drilling. I'm going to have to offset that some. Are my shoulders going to be happy when I say, okay, prices are down and I have to drop this down, and then production's going to go down and you're going to get less money? I mean, no, there's a point where I think keeping production, yes, I understand the logic of keeping production flat, but also the logic where operators said, hey, we're not adding oil into a market that's oversupplied. And most CEOs I talk to, and I don't necessarily agree with them, but most CEOs I talk to would say we're not oversupplied. We're going to be undersupplied. So the logic of saying we're not doing it because it wasn't oversupplied, that doesn't hold anymore then. Because I think you probably see, and I'm sure, passing around what River Oaks Club and all these Post Oak and all these places in Houston, people are talking. I don't think they're talking about an oversupplied market right now. Most CEOs are pretty optimistic and hopeful that, we're undersupplied and we have geopolitical tensions and oil prices are going up. So it just seems like the idea that you could say, hey, we're not going to add barrels because it's oversupplied, it just doesn't, there's nothing to that anymore.
Well, and fair thought on that. I won't argue with that piece. I guess from my perspective, I think a lot of public companies in our space are kind of in this no-win scenario. Obviously, at the end of the day, we work for the investors. We're a publicly traded company, so we work for the investors. The investors very clearly in 1819 were done with the overcapitalization, done with burning money, and they set up space and return free cash flow. We absolutely do that. And then, of course, public opinion and obviously investment opinion now as well is all driving towards more ESG. Don't ramp up your oil because that's going to ramp up your emissions. So from those two perspectives, it makes sense to stay where you are flat on oil. But we are a investment hungry industry, and I would love to go increase production. To go meet demand. I'm more energy driven than economic driven personally. I would love to go get more oil online to meet the energy demands of the world. But listening to investors and kind of sentiment right now, we're not doing that.
Absolutely. And I respect it and understand where it comes from. I know the economics and I know the pressures of public companies, and I get it. It's just, I really think it's, the E, S, and G. So we basically, we've leaned into the E piece, the environmental piece, which has nothing to do with the energy demand globally and prices, but we've leaned into that. So we have all this investor pressure to return money. So that you first had to return money to shareholders. And by the way, you don't have to, this is me ranting, so you don't have to necessarily comment directly on this, but you have that big E focus, and then you've got the whole, and return money to shareholders. Those are two different things, and you didn't have that E focus until really last year in earnest. And case in point, and ConocoPhillips is an example of that, of a company that is the first oil company to sign on to the Paris Climate Accords, going net zero by 2050. Well, the U.S. wasn't in the Paris Accords until January of 2021. So when people say this is very top down, this is a political ESG has flown into the public investors, flowed into the investor space. It can change, it can shift, and I think people just have to be cautious of that can shift with it. And I think there's going to be a lot of industry leaders that are going to have to, I wouldn't say eat their words, but they're going to have to shift a bit with it, because if you're leaning into the E so much, but the world has shifted around you, and then you sort of have to be producing oil to meet the demands, I mean, the rhetoric is just going to have to change a little bit. And so making money is important, but also at $90 oil, it's hard for me to it would be hard if the thesis is we have to make money and we have to do low carbon and everything. That's fine, but you also have to be honest with investors that here's my low carbon bucket. I'm Chevron, Exxon are putting, and I don't think ConocoPhillips says the percentage of capex that goes to it, but Exxon and Chevron said we're putting 1% to 2% of our capex in basically this ESG or lower carbon bucket. At least people are asking, BP, what are your returns for your wind farm? Because you paid a lot for the acreage. And so people eventually will be saying, you just spent 2% of your capex on this stuff that is basically a tax, right? It's not going to have a return on investment. And you did that at $90 oil, when how many dollars was that? How many wells would you have drilled, and could you have just returned that to shareholders? So it's just something that's not quite logical. And I know people, want to think it, like investors want to say it is, and folks want to say it is, but it's no different than when, everybody said buy into shale. I mean, buying into shale at $50 oil and spending every dime you have wasn't logical either, but companies did it. And so because the investors said you need to be into the Permian any and all costs. And I think we have to liken that a little bit to, BE and ESG any and all costs. And I think that there's some cost to it.
I won't deny that at all. And I think a lot of those decisions are made above my head on that piece of it. But all I can say is fair point on that one. I do want to touch on, I think we talked a little about it before, but what the whole scope 3, that's probably more out of my realm. Oh, yeah. But on the scope 1 and 2, I'm all 100. I mean, again, I'm energy driven. So on the scope 1, reducing our scope 1 emissions, and we work so hard to get the stuff out of the ground and sell it to provide energy. I want to reduce all my scope 1 and keep all that in the pipe and sell it. And the scope 2, that's kind of just a fascinating world. I mean, I know Conoco's doing it. I know a lot of other companies are doing it. Is how to get your scope 2s down. It's pretty hard right now as far as generating a competitive return. There's not many options out there right now.
Can we just clarify, because that's a great way to sort of close this and end this up, of that, just for listeners, is that ConocoPhillips and many other companies have been, obviously emissions is a big focus, scope 1, scope 2, and then in a lot of board meetings and stuff. And Conoco actually put theirs publicly, which I thought was, transparent and awesome, because I listened to it. And there was a big question on scope 3, and that was voted down by the shareholders. However, and the board did advocate to vote down. But however, there was a question in the last earnings call by Barclays on the scope 3. And just for the listeners, and I'm not an expert on it, but I'm going to get savvy, is scope 3 is end user emissions. So it's Bananaville. You would literally be having to manipulate the market to be saying, okay, I'm company X, ConocoPhillips or Exxon or whomever, and I'm going to decide who I'm selling my barrel to. And you can completely distort the market. I mean, because it's your end user emissions. And the goal with the people pushing scope 3, the goal is 100% to kill oil and gas. There's no other way about this of, yes, we're killing emissions, but in order to do that, you're reducing consumption and you're distorting the market. So I understand completely why companies are voting this down. I think they really do need to explain it a little better of what scope 3 is. But if you can do us a favor, because you guys do talk about reducing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, can you just clarify what scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and how you guys are going about doing that, and then why that scope 2 is so much harder?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, scope 1 is whether it's methane or CO2, it's the direct emissions that we are emitting. Scope 2 is more the ones I source through the power grid, electricity, all the electricity we use to power our ESPs and pumping units and all that kind of stuff. So on the scope 1, I mean, obviously the world has shifted from, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 years ago, whenever we tightened up on like water and oil leaks. You can see a water leak, you can see an oil leak. you can't see a gas leak, a natural gas leak coming, whether it's excuse me, whether it's coming out of a tank or a valve or any kind of weep, you can't physically see it. So we're ramping up hard on whether it's OGI cameras, flyovers. We do quarterly flyovers over already anyway. But anyway, it's basically the LiDAR, leak detection and repair. Anything we can do to go proactively detect a methane leak or CO2 leak for that matter, and then stop it and repair it and get it back online, we're definitely heading down that road real quick on the scope 1. The scope 2, obviously, and part of that, whether we have natural gas driven compressors or other natural gas engines out here, we're looking at putting electrified motors on those. So you're really shifting scope 1 to scope 2 in that frame. But in the scope 2 world, we're just trying to figure out whether we build solar panels, wind turbines, whatever, behind the grid, do it ourselves and own it, whether we put it in front of the grid and do a kind of co-op consortium, or frankly, just buy green power. And that, as far as I know, that's the 3 ways to do it to reduce your scope
But
2.
that's just your overall CO2 footprint, which I guess I'm more, the methane thing is a bigger, it's pretty big. So the ability to be handling that and doing it right, I'm all for that. I think it is harder on the scope 2, and I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be fruitful, because you are asking a lot of companies to sort of kill themselves on this stuff, and I'm not sure your footprint, your actual carbon footprint of installing all that stuff may be higher. So it just seems a little crazy to me, because I know that oil and gas production in the U.S. is 1%. The CO2 emissions from oil and gas production, I'm not saying methane, but CO2 emissions is 1% of U.S. emissions. So if every single company went down to zero, you're a drop in the bucket for CO2 emissions for the U.S. So I do think that has to be put in perspective. And I know a lot of companies don't want to talk about that, but it's a reality in terms of, killing yourself to install, wind and solar, which, is also not necessarily sustainable depending on where you're getting it from.
Well, I guess I agree with you. I guess the way I'd phrase it is I'm actively in my basin, and the other basin's the same. We're actively spending millions of dollars a year to go find and replace and fix these methane leaks and CO2. But we're actively spending money on that now because it makes sense environmentally, but it makes sense economically too, especially at this gas price. So that's bread and butter for us right now. On the scope 2, I would say we are in the analysis phase on that one, trying to figure out what's the right choice.
Yep. So I think that's evolving. Well, that's fantastic, and I really appreciate the clarity and the honesty. And lastly, so on the gas side, we just feel like we didn't touch on this. Is there more excitement? That has to be a little thing of, if anybody was not getting the gas, if there was any question on flaring and stuff, and I know that was a big initiative years ago, which most of us in the industry understand, why people flare sort of at the beginning. And most that, in North Dakota, it's always been an issue. Most of the wells that actually flared were actually connected. It was more about the size of the pipe and everything. But now, with gas prices, it's huge. Actually capturing all that, making sure there's an economic incentive when there wasn't before. And that's not an excuse that shouldn't have been done before. But even now in North Dakota, you're seeing companies actually throttle production back to make sure they're hitting their flaring requirements. So I think that's a reality. But I'm just curious on the gas side, if gas wasn't as exciting in the Permian, and the Permian produces a lot of natural gas, and we're talking probably it was 17 BCF that we're probably talking north of the associated gas production is massive, and the gas production is massive. But imagine that at 5 million barrels per day of crude oil production and 17 BCF a day, if I'm right, of gas, probably pushing 18 BCF a day, that is, you're trying to capture every little bit you possibly can.
Right. I absolutely agree. And it just, I guess we are definitely trying to reduce every amount of flaring we can, whether it's economic or just the right thing to do. It's both, honestly. I think you'll see some numbers come out in a while over time as things come out publicly. But we're doing everything we can to reduce flaring. And I think for the third and fourth quarter last year, and we're off to a good start this year, we have had some of our lowest flaring numbers ever. And I think part of that is, of course, now we have this midstream infrastructure built out everywhere. There's some little pockets here and there that they can't seem to keep the compression running. But a lot of what the flaring you see now, at least across for Conoco and maybe some of the basin as well, is we produce our gas, send it to the midstream, they compress it, send it on the pipeline. If their compressor drops, and we're not just going to blow up a tank battery, so we'll flare for probably an hour or two until we can get out there and shut the wells in proactively. So yes, that goes to flare. But what's kind of mind-boggling to me anyway is, I think I did the math a while ago, and if you flare for an 8-hour period in a month, that's 1% flaring. And we as a company are well below 1% flaring in the Permian right now. So to
Oh,
me,
good.
our ops teams are doing a phenomenal job. When you look at kind of what is actual 1% of a month, and we're flaring less than that. It's pretty amazing.
It'd be nice. I would love a dollar amount on that as well.
Yeah,
Just so to
yeah,
give the, and I think it's important if there's something nice about growing up around the business of because I flaring was always as a kid. I mean, you're flaring or venting, and you're
right,
venting, you're going straight into the environment. So flaring was the more beneficial option, and it's safety reasons, right? Sometimes you do have to for
sure,
safety reasons. You're always going to have that option. So it's not. I think especially at these prices, folks don't actually want to do it, and two, I mean, no, that nor should that should be absolutely being reduced, and especially given, it would be a very hard sell, regardless, given the energy crisis in Europe and floating around the world and higher gas prices of,
right,
folks flaring this. That being said, lots of lots of stuff is flared in Russia, lots of stuff is
sure.
flared in Nigeria, so it's flared and Iran. So I mean, those are real big issues. But with that. You've been anything else you would like to say? I don't want to cut you off
No,
by
I just appreciate the time here.
Absolutely. No, you've been a fantastic guest. I really appreciate the nerdy conversation and you being willing to talk. I think it's a really good overview of the Permian and Conoco and what you guys are doing. And I will absolutely have you back on the podcast and really
Sure.
appreciate you taking the time.
Nope. Always appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Bye.